Info listeners. This is Lisa Butterworth, and with me today is Colette Dalton.
Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Colette. We've introduced each other before in episodes, but we just work together and primarily treat Mormon LDS clients at Symmetry Solutions. Is there anything else that you want to say about yourself, Colette, to begin?
I think that's good. I think we can go from here. And I'm excited for this episode. If you hadn't heard, there is a documentary on Netflix that recently came out called Pray Away. And I saw that was coming out and I'm like, Lisa, we should probably watch this and do an episode about it.
Yes.
Before we go any farther though, it's about conversion therapy. And if you don't know what conversion therapy is, we are going to be discussing it. We are going to be talking about people's experiences with it. And this might be a triggering episode if you or a loved one has experienced conversion therapy in any form. I'd also say, as a queer person myself, I don't know that I'd recommend any queer people watching this film. It was heavy to see and it was hard to watch. But before we dive in, I just kind of want to give that trigger warning. So you have the option to not continue listening at this point. But if you do choose to continue listening to us talk about it, I hope you can gain some insights.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that it is wise to think about your own mental health and where you are in your journey and what kind of support you have and, like things like that before we go into looking at some of these, some of this content that contains a lot of traumatic experiences, especially if those experiences reflect our own experiences.
Yeah.
I think we often want to be a responsible person in the world and read and watch all the hard things that happen to people and, maybe use that as a source of information for our activism or making the world a better place. And that's a wonderful thing to do when you have the emotional energy and the support and the networks and have done your own work and you're in a good place. But even with all of those things in mind, sometimes, reading and watching other people's trauma can re-traumatize you. It can really affect you.
Yeah.
Pretty heavily. So.
Yeah. So I think it's just good. I love that you say, just be aware of where you're at, what your support systems are. No shame in turning off this episode or the documentary if you're watching it. Checking in with yourself is always a good idea.
Yeah. So starting with the documentary, it starts in a really interesting, uncomfortable, queasy, introducing place.
Yeah, I texted Lisa when the first scene came on. I'm like, I am so uncomfortable watching this. And she's like, yep. It was hard to sit with. Do you want to explain a little bit more?
Sure. So it starts with following this young person who identifies as a former trans person who has found Jesus, sort of proselytizing, sort of in front of a strip mall and approaching people and asking if they would like to pray with them. And I mean, I think currently he's using he pronouns.
Yeah, that was what I picked up.
Yeah, he used to use she pronouns, but it was, I honestly, just thinking about talking about it right this minute, it makes my stomach is hurting.
I was really, really uncomfortable. I think this documentary was really interesting. So the idea behind it is talking about survivors of conversion therapy and ex-gay activists kind of with their experiences. And so to start off with someone who is currently doing this is hard, but it's been used against so many queer people. I don't ever want to invalidate someone's personal lived experience, but it's hard when those sort of narratives have been weaponized. And so that can be very uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
This is his truth. Awesome. I don't know where to go from there though. When I see, from there, I don't know what else to say.
Right, it's really hard because on the one hand, this is his experience and what he's saying is true for him, and at the same time, they're interviewing 5 or 6 other people who used to be saying those same things. And now we're looking back and saying, wow, I did so much damage to myself. I did so much damage to other people. I cannot like I almost can't even make sense of how much damage I've done. And it's a really tricky place to sit in.
It is. Yeah. So I was glad, I didn't know entirely what to expect going into the documentary. So it was really uncomfortable starting off with that. Throughout the documentary, it follows different people. And so I was glad it wasn't focusing on that the whole time. I don't think I could have stomached watching all of that, knowing how it's been weaponized. From there, I forget who they go to next, but basically, as Lisa was saying, they have several leaders who used to be in this group called Exodus that was formed initially as a support group for queer people in Christian congregations. They, this person had looked around and said, hey, there's a group for single moms and there's a group for this population, like where's one for people like me who are gay? So they formed as a support group, and then it kind of morphed into an ex-gay movement of, oh yeah, I did identify as gay, I live that lifestyle, and I no longer identify that way. I've been healed through Christ.
Yeah. One of the themes, though, that I think all of the sort of ex-gay activists.
Yeah, how many X's do we say? Yeah.
The one of the themes that I think they all talked about was that for them, in their experience, they very much, when they were in the ex-gay movements and when they were activists and when they were doing the interviews, like they showed interviews on Donahue and, all kinds of news programs. And when they were in that headspace, that it was very much about behavior in their minds. Like, as long as I'm not acting like a person with same-sex attraction or homosexual thoughts, or as long as I'm not acting on it, then I can say that I'm an ex-gay person.
Right.
But every single one of them said that didn't actually change their internal experience, that they were still definitely, like it just became like a self-loathing for those thoughts that they were having about wanting relationships with people of the same gender. And so they all sort of had this experience of feeling like I lied to everyone, but I lied to myself even more.
Yeah. And they didn't always show years of when these interviews and things were happening, but it wasn't in the far too distant past that there was this big ex-gay movement. And like you were saying, some people definitely identify as ex-gay because they're not acting on it. I got the feeling that some truly did believe, like at that time, it wasn't that they were even not gay because they weren't acting on it. They truly believed, oh, I've been healed. One person that was followed met another person at Exodus. He was a gay man married a lesbian woman, got married. They'd both been saved, both been healed, started a family. And that didn't work out well for him. He started viewing gay porn, and he's now in a relationship with another man, showed that. And
I think he was the same one who, like as he was awakening to his still gayness, he decided to go to a gay bar and got caught by paparazzi. And
I think that was him.
And had the really humiliating and painful experience of being outed in that way. And then, also having just a ton of animosity directed at him from all of the gay people that he had hurt because he had been such an outspoken activist, ex-gay activist. Yeah, that was intense.
It was. I wonder if we should step back for those that aren't familiar just with the idea of conversion therapy and talk about that. We're talking about the ex-gay movement, kind of how that came about, if we can kind of talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, the Exodus itself started in the mid 70s, I think. It was 74, 76, something like that. Before that, I think even speaking the word homosexual was just not even done, right? So sort of the 60s and 70s opened up this new culture where you could even talk about being gay, and then people start having this awareness of being gay. And then it's interesting too that's oh, what is the timeline? I swear that that's also about the time when the APA took homosexuality out of
I think
the
so.
APA. So about
Yep.
the same time that psychologists said, well, homosexuality isn't a disease,
Mhm.
that's about the same time that conversion therapy sort of started filling in that gap in the mental health community.
Yeah.
Mental health being in big quotes in this case.
Right. As a note, pretty much any major true mental health organization representing licensed therapists and clinicians has come out and made statements against conversion therapy.
Which is also fairly recent.
Yes, in Utah, I think it was just a couple years ago that we passed a ban, but the ban is on conversion therapy for minors by licensed therapists.
Right.
You see how many loopholes there are in that.
Right. Yep.
That doesn't cover family members, that doesn't cover friends, that doesn't cover ecclesiastical
Churches.
leaders.
Yep.
Yep. It doesn't cover someone who's a life coach and not a clinician. So there's a lot of different loopholes there that people can still be, and it doesn't ban adults seeking conversion therapy.
Right.
And my question is, there's always the idea, oh, they're an adult, they can make decisions for themselves, but would they be seeking that out if we didn't live in such a queer, phobic, homophobic culture?
Exactly.
Because the idea of conversion therapy, it says, we can turn your sexual attractions to, quote, normal. We can turn your gender identity to, quote, normal, meaning straight and cis. That's the idea behind conversion therapy. The idea that it is a disease, it is something wrong, and it's something that needs to be fixed. And so that's the idea behind for conversion therapy. And it used to be very brutal. I think sometimes when people hear conversion therapy in their minds, and I should say physically brutal,
right.
Still brutal, no matter how it's done. But like literally using electroshock treatments to sort of train away the gay, right?
Right. Which happened to BYU.
Yes, that is a fact not everyone is aware of. It happens at BYU. There were studies
not currently
at BYU. No, back in the 70s, but it still happens. It was something that was used. Conversion therapy now still happens. It's not as physically brutal, but it's still insidious and it still causes so much harm. I know you've worked with some clients who kind of experienced some lighter forms of conversion therapy.
Yeah.
To use that term. What was your experience like?
Well, it's interesting because a lot of practitioners, LDS practitioners who used to do straight up conversion therapy, I think, like adjusted their methods slightly and continued offering pretty much the same services. The clients I have had who have encountered this, like they're very careful to say, I'm not trying to change your orientation, but we're going to focus on your behavior and your choices so that you keep them in line with the church, right? And so it isn't necessarily like we're going to make you not be gay. They're very careful, but these are still licensed practitioners, and they're not saying we will help you not be gay or never to have another gay thought again. And the methods that I have had sort of reported back to me have to do with sort of, like mindfulness techniques almost like, okay, like if you have a homosexual thought, notice it, don't beat yourself up about it, but then change what you're thinking about and don't think about that anymore. So that's not electroshock,
right?
But it is sort of like, okay, you have a kid, you have one of your siblings that nobody in the family really likes, everybody just ignore her. Like it's abuse by neglect or something. I don't know. I mean, like that's kind of primarily the type of thing that I'm seeing now that people are practicing. I mean, it feels really, again, just talking about it kind of makes my stomach hurt because again, I see my clients who have spent 10, 20 years trying to, going in weekly, sometimes bi-weekly, trying to not think about a part of them that is pretty fundamental to who they are.
Right.
And then, like one day waking up and being like, oh, wait, I'm 40 years old and I've never been in a relationship with someone, and I'm lonely, and I've got autoimmune disease, and, like how
Yeah.
many of these things are connected to the fact that like I've been spending all of my emotional energy trying not to think about the fact that I am who I am.
Yeah. Yeah. Going off of that, I think a lot of times when there's very othering language sometimes when people talk about the queer community, us versus them, and the idea that sexuality is just about sex. And I actually did a very interesting activity in a CEU training earlier this week, where for 5 minutes, our facilitators had us write down answers to these questions. And it was like, how do you spend your free time? Who are your most important relationships in your life? Where are important places to you? And just kind of these questions about that. I'm like, okay, weird, whatever, let's do this. Didn't seem related. And then we got paired off into groups of 2 with a partner. And we had to have a 5-minute conversation with them and not talk about anything that was on that list of answers we had given. And that was so poignant to me because it really made me feel like I was back in the closet. When I was closeted, there were people I couldn't talk about. There were places I couldn't talk about going to, all sorts of different things that were part of me and part of my queerness. I wasn't having sex, but it was part of me. And so conversion therapy, trying to hide myself, trying to hide all these things. This has been a little hard to come to terms with. And I have a hard time saying it. I think I kind of experienced some conversion therapy in a way when I was first dealing with my sexuality. I had fallen in love with this woman. We were dating, but we were both still trying to be good members of the church. And whenever I went to confess to a bishop, very much like, you need to stop this behavior, everything. And when I finally went to see a therapist, it was almost like he just downplayed my identity. Oh no, you're not really gay. It's just, weird things can happen when you are emotionally close to someone and make you think that you're gay. And I think that sort of conversion therapy actually made it a lot longer for me to realize I actually was gay. I was telling people for a long time, I'm straight except for this one person. It's a weird fluke. Looking back, that's not generally how sexuality is. So it's just kind of interesting looking back. I can't remember all the exact conversations, but just the idea of LDS people or Christian people kind of imposing their values onto me and I just took that because I'm like, yeah, these are my values, but I had never taken the chance to really examine, are these my values?
Right.
Is this what I'm wanting to do? And it was so invalidating to be told like, no, you don't actually like her. You just think you do, it was so odd, and a type of conversion therapy, I think.
Right. And there's definitely like a real impact on your life and the lives of my clients to that kind of, I guess I'll call it gaslighting, that's kind of what it is. Like, no. That's not really how you feel. That's not really what you feel. Yeah. They didn't go much into the methods of conversion therapy in this program. It was really more like telling people's personal stories. They showed clips occasionally from, conferences where they were talking about how Jesus saved them from their sexual impulses, from their sin. Yeah.
Sin of thinking, yeah.
But they didn't go much into like what it looked like on the ground day to day,
right,
in the documentary itself, which might be a good thing, like if you were to find that triggering.
With how triggering it already was, like, don't know if we need that.
Yeah. I also think it's interesting how, at least with my clients that I've had, like, I think most of them described their sort of conversion therapy light in complex terms.
Yeah.
because they often felt like their therapist was still pretty helpful, like one of the few
Mm-hmm.
people in their lives who wasn't shaming them,
For sure.
like even if they were sort of like complicit in the culture of trying to make them deny who they were.
Mm-hmm.
And so that even that has been like a really complex and interesting situation to have, it's like somebody be in that middle space. And also, like feeling like, well, I chose that. I was an adult and I asked them for
Mm-hmm.
that, and they
Right.
gave me what I asked for.
Yep.
And while I understand that and I honor my clients' experiences, like I definitely have a little judgmental person in the back of my brain who kind of wants to go down and smack those people around a little bit.
Yeah. And I feel the same way. When I saw that first therapist, that was what I wanted. I wanted to stay in the church. But then comparing that to other therapists I saw after him, who really took the time to be like, I see that you're struggling with wrestling with this. What do you want? Like, let's explore the different possibilities as you wrestle with this, instead of saying, okay, since you were saying you want to be Mormon, these must be your values, knock it off. Right. And just weird ideas behind, saying his theory about how my girlfriend became attracted to women, about the idea of, the emotional closeness. And it was just odd looking back. And it's just so hard. We see the damage from these conversion therapy experiences, even if it's not what some people think of as conversion therapy. I think at the very end of the documentary, they said over 700,000 individuals in the US have experienced some form of conversion therapy. And at the end of the documentary, they said, this is dedicated to the survivors of conversion therapy, and especially those who didn't survive. And I was just like, oof.
I mean, the other thing they said at the very end, along with that, about the non-survival, was that people who experienced conversion therapy were twice as likely to complete suicide.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like not a small, that's double.
Yeah. And I mean, I remember doing a presentation about suicide to a group of individuals who were active church members. And I decided to throw on some LGBTQ stats up there and see what happens. And someone said, well, isn't church a protective factor against suicide? And I was like, yes and no. For some people, having strong spiritual beliefs and values and a connection with God can be a huge protective factor against suicide. But for people, sometimes especially queer people, religion can be used as a stick and a way to punish, make shame, guilt, make people feel bad, which can increase suicide risk, can increase feeling lack of belonging. And belongingness is a huge thing to look at in suicide risk. If someone feels like they belong.
Yeah. It's one of the main factors, in fact.
It's huge.
One of the things that I think is interesting to think about is those studies that show that, spirituality is a protective factor. They don't show causation, right?
Right.
And so it isn't necessarily that going to church is going to be protective. It is more like people who fit in at church and meet the narrative of church, who go to church, they're going to self-select church. And then that's going to be a community where, because they aren't gay or because they aren't, whatever, not fitting in some way, they do have access to community that, like isn't accessible for gay folk. So it isn't saying that like there is a causal element in spirituality being protective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. It totally does. And I see that in my own life. So much of the distress did come from, well, where do I fit in now? If I'm queer, I can't be a member of the church, right? And so just trying to figure out what that meant for me and my spirituality, what that meant for my friend groups. One thing that really helped me was finding and making friends with other queer people and having that belonging. That was huge. And
Absolutely.
I think you bringing up the church stuff also brings up the idea that conversion therapy isn't just happening in therapy offices sometimes. What messages are being preached over the pulpit or in Sunday school classrooms or in homes that are forms of conversion therapy?
Right. Very true. And going back to the belonging piece,
Uh-huh.
you know, a lot of these sort of ex-gay activists, a lot of the people who sort of recognized how much harm they had been doing, one of the things they talked about being really important to them in that Exodus group was community.
For sure.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where, you know, we have a need for community as human beings. And
We do.
even when we mean well, we can sometimes create toxic community, because I don't think any of these people started out thinking, I'm going to do a ton of damage and hurt a ton of people.
Right.
Maybe
But
a
they
few
wanted
of
the
them.
community. They wanted community.
And the way that they were able to get, you know, like social capital in that community was by being vocally ex-gay and telling everybody else how they also could be ex-gay, right? Like there was this social capital element to it where like I can have belonging if I tell everyone that I'm no longer gay, that Jesus saved me from it. And there's just such a power to that kind of power dynamic.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing up that point. That was a thing expressed by several members that were interviewed, several people that were interviewed from Exodus. And that brings up a great point of the need for human connection and belonging.
Yeah. And, you know, like there are definitely churches out there that are very, like, if you are gay and if you feel a call to spirituality, there are a ton of options out there of like accepting, you know, communities that are not going to do anything like conversion therapy.
Yeah. I remember I went once to a Community of Christ Sunday service here in Salt Lake, and I drove up and there was a rainbow flag out front. And then I walked inside and there was a queer couple sitting in front of me with their arms around each other. And I was like, what alternate universe am I in? You know, continuing the thought of the conversion therapy isn't just happening in therapy offices of unethical people. It can be happening in churches by people who mean very well. And it was just so interesting feeling so welcomed, even not being out, but just seeing, wow, there's a rainbow flag in front of this church. And there's a couple who feels comfortable enough to be sitting in church with their arms around each other, expressing affection to another individual of the same gender. You know, feeling some conversion therapy from church of not knowing, not having information about what happens to queer people in the next life, to saying, oh, you know, don't worry about it. You'll be fine. It'll all work out in the next life. The idea of you'll be straight in the next life, that's some celestial conversion therapy that I am not behind.
Right. You're like, no, thank you.
No. I don't think you're taking away a core part of who I am, thanks. But there's no explanation as to where do people fit in if they aren't married to someone of the opposite gender.
Right. Like erasure of your experience and of your, you know, like erasure of you in the narrative.
Yeah. So there are other ways it's happening, you know, comments from well-meaning family and friends that might be happening that, you know, where is the line between conversion therapy and just living in a heteronormative culture? Assuming someone's straight and asking about their boyfriend when really they're dating women and things like that. Is that actually conversion therapy or is that heteronormativity? I don't know, but
I don't know either. I mean, I feel like there's between these things, there's always usually like a big gray band. I don't know, you know?
And so many different shades of gray too. I think sometimes you're like, oh yeah, I live in the gray. It's not just one shade of gray. You have the very, very, very light, almost white gray, silvers, down into that dark charcoal gray that's almost black. So,
right.
so much in there. I don't know if you had more to say about how conversion therapy maybe pops up in social settings and things.
No, I was trying to think back on the documentary itself, if there was anything else that really struck me or jumped out at me. How
Well,
about for you?
one thing that struck me was just how recent this is. Like I said, they didn't show years on everything, but when we think about what's happened in the US in the past few years, same-sex marriage just became legal across the United States 6 years ago. Prop 8 was something that was mentioned in the documentary. That was in 2008. I was a sophomore in college at BYU, and they asked all members from California, of which I was one, I grew up in California, to go to a special meeting. And this meeting, they asked all of us to volunteer our time to call people in California and urge them to vote against same-sex marriage. This is recent history. They were following one woman who's probably my age, who is she was in Exodus, but she realized this isn't right for me anymore. It's doing damage. And it showed her marrying her partner, this lovely woman. And oh man, talk about how emotional that was to see. But I just want to highlight how recent this is. And I think the uncomfortableness of that opening scene was highlighted again at the end when they continued his story, and they pointed out Exodus may have disbanded, but there's always other people willing to take up the banner and continue on in this ex-gay movement and to continue to provide conversion therapy. When my thought is, would people even want conversion therapy if they weren't in a world where heteronormativity was expected?
Right. Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
No, you're right.
I was talking to a client recently, and she said, my issue isn't the fact that I am homosexual. My issue is homophobia. And I'm like, well, yep, you summed that up well.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, like the suicides that are happening in the gay community aren't the mental illness of the gay community. They're the rejection of the system and the community as a whole, right? Like this is what happens to human beings who are systematically rejected.
Yes.
Like that's the problem. I think one of the ending scenes that was really powerful for me was when, sort of the Exodus folk sat down after Prop 8. Wasn't it after Prop 8? They invited, like there were all of these people from the, LGBTQ community saying, you're hurting us, let's have a conversation. And they sat down, they went into they showed videos of it down in like a church basement or something. First of all, like, wow. To those vulnerable people who were willing to go in and tell their stories in the face of all of that rejection. Like that's just amazing. I got chills going down my arm just thinking about it. Like what a vulnerable situation to put yourself in, to sort of face people who have been telling you, and that vulnerability like broke at least all of the people they were interviewing for this show, right? Like every single one of them talked about that conversation as being pivotal in their realization that they were hurting people.
They were trying to help with this community, but realizing how much hurt. And one of them said how someone had told him, you have blood on your hands. And he's like, I know, I'm scared to look at them. I'm scared to look at my hands because I know how much must be there. He didn't think at the time, thought he was doing something good, but realizing the damage that is done, it's sobering. And it's hard being in institutions that are still, or interacting with institutions that are still having clients who are interacting with institutions that are still causing this massive hurt, and having to try to help them heal when they're still in institutions that are hurting them.
Right. And in being in the position of being their therapist, right? Like I've had quite a few LGBTQ folks who still wanted to remain active in the church. And it is not my job to tell them that that is a bad idea for their mental health, right? Like, I mean, I can tell them, like, here are, like the things that that are common
Mhm.
to experience in that. And if you, like, if you want to choose it, I will support you as best I can.
Mhm.
Like, I'm not going to tell you that you shouldn't be going to church.
Mhm.
I mean, luckily, all my clients so far have eventually decided for themselves that, like, they just, the community wasn't a place where they were feeling the spirit anymore
Mhm.
for themselves, right? Like, but it wasn't my job to tell them that they weren't going to feel the spirit at church.
Right.
And that feels hard sometimes.
Yeah. And that's hard. I don't want to judge anyone's journey. There are people who can stay in religious institutions that others feel are very harmful for them, and it works for them. Great. But it also, like, it does a lot of damage to a lot of people too. And that's, I think, one thing that's also very hard, maybe again, conversion therapy of sorts, is using other people's narratives to say, well, they did it, why can't you?
Oh, yeah.
I think that's a big one in religious communities, that honestly the church is kind of good at. I feel like the people who share their stories are super good and clear about saying, this is my story, do not use this against anyone else. Everyone's different. No one is less than for choosing differently. This is just my experience that I'm sharing. But people are so good at still using those stories and saying, hey, they're staying single and celibate in the church, why can't you? They divorced their same-sex partner so that they could be members of the church, why can't you?
Or they stayed in a mixed orientation marriage
Mhm.
and continued to go to church with their
Mhm.
straight spouse. Why
Mhm.
can't you?
And that may work for them, but that doesn't mean it has to work for you or that it will work for you. And that is one reason I'm so grateful for therapy and for wonderful therapists that helped me explore my own values to figure out what would work and wouldn't work for me, and didn't impose their values, that didn't do any even accidental conversion therapy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's a tough line as a therapist
Yeah.
to walk, because I have definitely had clients who came into me specifically because their previous therapist just said, well, why don't you just leave the church then? In this
Mhm.
really kind of like flippant way, as though
Mhm.
that was going to be the simple, easy answer. And like, they realized that they needed the support of someone who actually understood
Right.
the depth of the effect of the community. Like, a lot of churches that people have experienced, you really can just choose a different church.
Mhm.
Even
Totally
shaming
smart.
that can happen. Like, I've definitely had clients who came in that felt like their previous therapist had shamed them for not leaving Mormonism.
Yeah, and I've had several clients do the same thing, and I'm like, no, it's not that easy. I think a lot of people who don't grow up in Mormonism don't realize how all-encompassing that can be.
Right.
And it's not a matter of finding a different pastor within, your church or whatever. It's Mormonism can be your family. It's how you spend your Sundays. It's how you spend your free time during the week. It's who your friends are. It's not necessarily as easy as just, well, find a different one.
Right. Which, again, that does work for some people, but it's still not easy, right? Like,
Right.
I definitely know people that, go moving to a different church where there was, like, an accepting and pro LGBT community
Mm-hmm.
has been a wonderful experience. But, like, you're always going to feel a little bit like, I think Mark Quinn used the term, a cosmic orphan.
Oh, wow. That's powerful.
Right? Like, you're always going to feel a little bit like you've been adopted by loving parents, but
Mm-hmm.
that your original, spiritual community rejected you. And there's really deep pain in that.
Yeah. Well, and that also, I think, highlights how it can be hard for so many individuals and their families. Parents who have different religious beliefs around what it means to be gay. Oh, one other thing with that reminds me from the documentary. the slippery slope argument, them
Oh,
bringing
right.
up that idea, that was triggering because I'm like, I've heard all these things and used to believe them, right? Because I was so closeted even to myself, like, oh yeah, if we allow same-sex marriage, what's to stop people from marrying animals or children? And anyways, I don't know how to sum all and tie everything up. I feel like I've been all over the place because this documentary was so impactful, well, so just affecting for me. And I'm not sure what other thoughts you might be having.
I mean, I think overall, I think it was well done. It was full of a lot of humanity, just holding space for people to be on their journey. Like, I don't feel like it had a strong, what would I say? Like, agenda as far as like condemning individuals, which I like.
Right.
Like,
Right.
it was really more about, like showing the system and how it harms people. It was intense. It was, I don't know, something that you should definitely gauge whether you are ready for. I mean, I think it for some people, it might be really informative and healing and validating.
For sure, to realize not just you, hundreds of thousands of people have had similar experiences.
Right. And, and I really appreciate that. They documented this and packaged it up in a way that maybe more people will have an opportunity to see the damage that's being done.
Right.
Yeah.
I hope it can soften some hearts. I just don't know who are the people who are going to watch this, who decide to be like, oh yeah, this sounds interesting on Netflix. But I hope it can open people up to just hearing other people's stories and realizing how systemic damage can be done.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's always the problem of preaching to the choir, right? Like, how do you reach people who wouldn't click on it?
Right.
I mean, I think that there's a lot of different, my daughter, who identifies as a lesbian, sent me a book about a girl who went through conversion therapy that I'm currently reading, and it's harrowing. And I thought first of all, I thought it was interesting that my daughter was like, oh, Mom, read this book. It's so good. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, it's good, but man, it's like going to give me nightmares.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know there's a lot of narratives out there, and Netflix is a big distributor, right? Like, it does open up access to these stories to somebody who maybe doesn't read a lot, or, like Netflix has a huge distribution.
Yeah.
So.
And I haven't really done my research to see what other people are saying. This I just watched last night, still kind of processing, but it's been good talking about it with you. So thank you for watching it with me virtually.
Absolutely.
And talking about it.
It was my pleasure. And I'm glad that I'm going to be honest, when I first saw it on Netflix, before you even mentioned it, it was absolutely one of those things where I put it in my queue and I think, oh yeah, I should watch that. But then, I'm doing my own assessment of like how much emotional bandwidth I have. And I'm glad I watched it. I feel like I have a much clearer idea of what the Christian form of this. I mean, I feel like I know quite a bit about what it looked like in the Mormon community.
Right.
And so it was good information for me to have, just to improve my cultural competence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for this discussion.
Absolutely. And thank you for all you listeners who stuck with us through that whole discussion. If you have any questions or comments, you can post them at the Symmetry Solutions website or on Facebook. And we really appreciate you listening. And if you want to donate a few dollars to the Mormon Sex Info podcast, that money goes to our wonderful editors. And we appreciate it very much.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles, and as the evening traveled on. The sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary,
Ordinary.
no, it's extraordinary.